into the house?
Well, it's going well, thank you. It was the house that we really wanted, and so it was really nice to just be able to move into it. And we bought a new furniture. I even assembled my own bed for the first time. So yes, I thought I had no practical skills at all, and showed that I did. And yes, so it's really, and we decorated all the rooms, and I finally realized my dreams of putting Pompeian red in the dining room.
Nice.
I don't know whether it was a wise choice, but I like it for now.
Yeah.
And so it's going very well, thank you. Yeah, so I think that we will enjoy the new place when it will be properly furnished. We will enjoy it even more. But yes.
Oh, that's good. Moving is just one of those stressful things you can ever do.
Yes.
Well, I suppose home buying to begin with is stressful, and then moving all the stuff in and redecorating. Hey, do you speak to Charlie much, the IT guy for Seckel? Charlie, who does IT, really tall.
Yes.
He's been redecorating his house recently.
Yes, he told me actually. Yes.
Apparently, like for months on end, they've been redecorating the ground floor, so everything is upstairs at the moment. He's just like, I'm so sick of it. He's like,
yes, and he told me that for a while he was without a wall or something like that. So, well, for a short period of time last year. So yeah, I mean, yes, it's very disruptive, but at the same time, it's exciting, and you get the chance to throw away a lot of stuff and give it to charities and declutter your house. So we even watched Marie Kondo on Netflix to get some advice, but then we decided that it was making us too anxious. So we just decided not to follow the advice too much. Otherwise, we would have ended up putting everything in tiny boxes as she does. So yeah, that's a bit extreme. So we aim to be a bit more, a bit tidier, but not like her.
yeah,
not OCD really.
Does Michael actually own a lot of Star Wars stuff?
Yes, he does.
Does he? Did he contemplate getting rid of it at all? Just because I have loads of Star Wars toys from when I was younger, and I still can't part with them.
No, it doesn't have that much. I think it can still be integrated in the house. And yeah, it's no, not too much actually. Yeah. But there are lots of things in his house in Colchester.
Okay.
So
that's the thing, isn't it? That's the benefits of parents. Everything stays with them.
Exactly. Well, one day we will bring them. Maybe, we'll see.
Real.
Together with,
I can bring my toys around and play with it.
But it's also good because when we go to Colchester, we go back to Michael's childhood, so we start playing with Star Wars figurines. So it's cool, to take things out, Lego, and as
nice.
well. It's very good. But we have some Rogue One Lego.
Oh wow!
Yes, at home. So when we want to play, we have things to play with.
Oh, brilliant. So the book is now out.
Yes.
Well, first of all, we'll start with, what's the book about?
So the title is Becoming a Woman and Mother in Greco-Roman Egypt. And so the book is about women and children in Greco-Roman Egypt. And it's about, I would say the simple definition is about their everyday life. So I try to touch on many aspects of their everyday life. But I would say that the common theme of the book is also women's reproduction. And how women's body and especially the reproductive phases of women are perceived by society. So I studied the coming of age and puberty for girls and all the rituals associated with the coming of age, then pregnancy and childbirth. And then also some aspects which are really not really understudied, at least for Greco-Roman Egypt, but also for other societies as well, which are, for example, how society perceives the menstruation. So all the aspects of pollution and rituals related to the access to temples, for example. So whether women could actually enter temples during menstruation. And the similarities between menstruation and childbirth in terms of pollution and purification, both in religious rituals. So, for example, the access to temples in Greco-Roman Egypt seems to have been denied to women who were menstruating, and also women who had just given birth, and women who had just had a miscarriage, for example. So I'm trying to put together all of these elements and these similarities that have never really been investigated together. And through all of these studies, I also see how Greco-Roman Egypt is a sort of a mix of different cultures. And you have a sort of a change in beliefs and cultural perception or social perception of women going from dynastic Egypt, so pharaonic Egypt, to Greco-Roman Egypt. So when the Greeks and the Romans brought their new values, their new culture. And so the perception of women's body really changed from ancient Egypt, from dynastic Egypt to Greco-Roman Egypt. And so I think that studying women's bodies, reproductive phases throughout this broad period and all these changes throughout this broad period really shows the cultural changes in Egypt. So moral, cultural, and religious changes in Egypt. So it's a very complicated topic. I think I reached quite a few conclusions there. From the general ones, so cultural changes, moral changes, to specific ones regarding all the different phases of women's reproductions and how they were perceived and either celebrated or stigmatized, or certainly. So I think I have raised many issues, and each chapter can potentially have a spin-off book on its own, really. So it's I don't think it is a conclusive study. I think it is a study that shows how much you can do with an interdisciplinary approach, and how much you can do by connecting dynastic Egypt with Greco-Roman Egypt, and not just keeping these two periods separated, as nowadays it happens all the time, because dynastic Egypt tends to be studied by Egyptologists, Greco-Roman Egypt by classicists, and so I try to say no. Now we need to study these two periods together, because otherwise you can't understand Greco-Roman Egypt without knowing what happens in dynastic Egypt. You can't understand why there are certain laws, why there are certain beliefs, religious beliefs, especially at the domestic levels. Certain traditions are really long-lasting. They last into the Roman and late antique period. So you need to have a longer perception, really.
That's really interesting what you're saying about how people have approached pharaonic Egypt separate to Greco-Roman Egypt.
Yes.
This is something that I suppose this actually relates to what I was talking about with Phil last week on the podcast, because Phil is at Leicester. He's looking at the Roman interaction with prehistoric monuments in Roman Britain. And there has always been this tendency in the past across the study of history and archaeology, as you say, to compartmentalize how we approach it. So this is this period, this is this period, and there isn't that much of a crossover. But actually, as is always the case, there's probably a fair bit of continuity, and the monuments, the legislation, the literature, etc., or whatever. There's a lot of things that feed through from previous periods into later periods, and as you say, you can't really understand the later periods necessarily as well as you could do if you didn't look at the stuff that had come before. That it's and it's important to kind of understand, I think, the interaction between different periods of the past. So as you're saying, between the Greco-Roman approach to, you might say, the legacy of pharaonic Egypt, particularly as you're saying in relation to the lives of women.
Definitely, yes. Of course, there are limits to this, lack of compartment. It's a very difficult word anyway. And so one of the main limits is that there are lots of Egyptian languages and writings to learn. So, and I'm not saying I'm an expert either, to be honest. I had really a sort of working knowledge of Egyptian writing. So it's really, I'm really, by that point of view, by the point of view of writing written documents, I'm more of a classicist. So I'm much more confident when I read Greek and Latin than when I read Demotic. But obviously, I think that you need to try to approach also Egyptian texts, even if they are in translation, even if you don't know the language very well, but you still need to try as much as possible to approach the original source and do your best, really. So this is what blocked, I think, many classicists. Is still limiting many classicists. So we need to be brave there, and we might make mistakes. We can still, have experts in Egyptian languages helping us. I had my PhD supervisor, that is no longer my PhD supervisor now, but Chabalada, who read my work and gave me advice when I commented on demotic texts. So there are ways to bridge these gaps. So it's important to do it. So
one thing I'm quite interested in, with very similarly to when Sophie was on the podcast talking about women in Republican Rome, did you find any examples of particular women in the text where you're able to trace their story or find out aspects of their lives, and actually, because you're saying, talking about the lives of everyday women, were you actually able to look at particular women, like actual particular individuals? Did any kind of come out of the evidence for you, or was, as you say, because it's interdisciplinary, so you're kind of combining evidence, so was it quite difficult to actually get to the individuals? How did you find that?
Well, I think that you get for Greco-Roman Egypt, you really get the real individuals. You don't get a literary version of the individuals because you get their private letters. So the individual emerges without filters there. Or we can say at least the only filters that emerge are the ones that, the individual puts to present himself or herself to her own relatives or to the person he or she is writing to. So it's a very genuine and direct way to approach individuals from the past, and so quite unique. So I deal mainly with this kind of sources rather than literary sources. So yes, these are my individuals. They are really everyday women, non-elite, mainly non-elite women from Greco-Roman Egypt. Most of the times they are Greco-Egyptian women, so they speak Greek, and sometimes they have Egyptian names. Sometimes they are, they express, obviously I look at letters that deal with childbirth, for example, or coming of age, or so. Sometimes they are, for example, giving birth. So they're asking for their sister to come to assist them. So normal concerns, really, everyday concerns. I think the individual emerges in quite a natural and genuine way in these documents.
Going through, because obviously this is kind of what the book's about, but going through particularly the letters, do you get a sense of that a woman's position in Egyptian society, albeit the Pharaonic period or later, is quite different to the way it's been perceived in the past? People had ideas of what a woman's role in Greco-Roman/Pharaonic Egypt would have been, and actually when you look at the letters, does it suggests that perhaps their role isn't quite what the stereotype, I suppose the best word, has usually been for that?
Well, I think that there wasn't really a sort of general idea of what, the status of women was from dynastic Egypt to Greco-Roman Egypt. So I think that classicists especially studied these documents from Greco-Roman Egypt and considered them as a Greco-Roman documents, in the wider Greco-Roman context. So they found, examples of Roman law within Roman Egypt, Roman Egyptian legal documents. which, in a way it's right, because the Roman law was applied in Egypt, but there are also local differences which need to be considered. So I don't know whether I have really moved things radically in terms of preconceptions, but I certainly gave lots of small examples about understudied aspects, like coming of age. Was it really existing? Was there a ritual? Why there was a ritual to celebrate women during their coming of age, and why there wasn't such a ritual before the Greco-Roman period? So why? It means that it wasn't that important, probably. And why wasn't it important, coming of age? Because when the fact that women became marriageable wasn't particularly important in dynastic Egypt. Women just married, and there wasn't even a particularly elaborate rituals to marry in dynastic Egypt. They just entered the house. They just became the owners, the mistresses of the house. That was the title. That's it. While in Greco-Roman Egypt, there was it was like the Roman marriage. So the woman entered the house of the husband, and there was the exchange of the ring, all these things. So, yeah, and there was a marriage contract especially. So something visible, really, that you don't have before. So there are big changes that you can see through the law, and through the private letters as well, of course, because the private letters reflect these changes. For example, one of the things we can see through the private letters are exposure of children. So there is a famous letter where a husband says to a wife, if it's a girl, expose her.
Oh dear.
Exactly. So now I don't remember exactly the date, but it's we don't know very much about the context of this letter, but we know that exposure of children was something that existed in Greco-Roman Egypt, while it's not attested in dynastic Egypt. So that's such a change. It's a huge change. And there is another letter, a petition, if I remember well, where a woman is allowed by the family of the husband to expose the child that she had from her husband in order to be able to remarry. So she gets rid of this child, and then she's free to remarry. So how terrible is this? So the family of the husband is not interested in raising this child. They're just exposing it. That's it. And exposed children basically were left there either to die or to be raised, picked up by others and raised as slaves, more probably, because slaves were very expensive. So if you found a baby, you normally raised it. But I guess children with disability were just left to die, really. Unless,
Grim stuff.
Yeah.
How did attitudes towards menstruation change then over time? Were there quite big shifts in that between Pharaonic Egypt to Greco-Roman Egypt?
I would say that's the context where I found the least changes.
Okay.
Interestingly enough, there is a sort of a similarity there between ancient Egyptian traditional beliefs about menstruation and Greek beliefs about menstruation. So both in Egypt and in Greece, it seems like the blood of menstruation and childbirth was somehow polluting and required a period of purification. And so, for example, in Egypt, you find a story in a papyrus called the Papyrus Westcar. You find a story of a woman giving birth. She gives birth to future pharaohs. And basically, after giving birth, she has to rest for 7 days. So in a sort of purification period is not, it's used, the word purification is actually used in here. While in Greek sources we find, for example, the lex sacra for the access to the temples. So women cannot have access to temples 40 days, sometimes for less. It varies. So after giving birth, and also menstruation, as I said to you, is included in these rules. In Egypt, again, we have childbirth, and we have also menstruation. We have a sort of similar list of rules, like the Lex Sacra in Greece. So you cannot have access to certain temples during menstruation. It's defined as an abomination, menstruation, so something that is a bit taboo especially for certain areas, for certain specific cities in Egypt. So yeah, there is a sort of similarity there, and I think that it's not a coincidence, this similarity. The reason why menstruation, so the blood basically, is considered a taboo both in Greece and in Egypt is because they are both very much connected to Near Eastern culture as well, and we can see also this in Jewish culture. So where in Near Eastern culture we find, since the earliest times in Sumerian literature, Hittite literature, we find this taboo of the blood. And so women were forbidden from entering to temples. And there are also other similarities with other bodily fluids, like, for example, sperm or fluids from diseases. So these are all connected elements that are connected. And I also look at Near Eastern sources in order to show this.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to ask about that. You mentioned about the Sumerians, the Hittites.
Yes.
Are there other people studying similar themes in different periods, different geographical areas? And is there a kind of, are you in contact with them? Is there kind of dialogue going on between different people studying in different periods? Because you were saying about the tendency we have of compartmentalizing that word again, history, and obviously, as you're saying, there's the benefits of looking at elements of continuity from these different periods, but obviously you can't study everything. But there are other people that are studying similar themes in different periods and different areas. So is there much of a dialogue going on between? There isn't
much of a dialogue. I am open to this, and to be honest, I think that. What would be needed is a conference about it, because it's very difficult to just meet someone that is. They are from a different discipline, really. So the Near Eastern archaeologists or historians. So normally you don't find them in the same conference. Unfortunately, I managed to meet a Near Eastern archaeologist that had similar interests. Only once in a conference, so it's very difficult to meet them. There was a project a few years ago about pollution and purity, and the proceedings were very, very helpful for me, because they gave me a sort of a general idea about this topic in Greece, in Hittite culture, in Jewish culture. So there was something done. I wasn't part of it yet, but it was really helpful. So
just on that, actually going off on a slight tangent about interconnectivity in interest in the ancient world. A number of years ago, you set up the Women in Antiquity Facebook group. Right? It's still going now as well.
It's still going. I'm a bit lazy. I should post more things.
How many followers did you end up getting for it?
Well, I have about 6,000 something. Yeah.
It's garnered a really big following, but I found it quite interesting, because I think that's very reflective of the desire now for people to look at aspects like you've looked at yourself of women in the ancient world, particularly the lives of everyday women in the ancient world. And I think it was going back to when, let's say, Sophie was on the podcast as well, she was talking about populating the image that we have of the ancient world. Obviously in the past it's been very male dominated, also very white as well, but understanding now that there's a lot more people inhabiting these spaces when we picture them in our minds than traditionally thought. Since you started that group, do you find that there's been a kind of rising interest in that? There has, even before that, there was rising interest, but were you quite surprised, I suppose, in some respects, the reaction the group got?
I was very surprised, and I felt the need to actually open a Facebook group alongside the page. So I have Women in Antiquity and Women in Antiquity Network, which is the Facebook group. And I think that is also very successful because it actually gives a sort of chance to people to, interact, ask questions to each other. So I post very rarely on Women in Antiquity Network. I set it up, and after basically a month, it just ran itself. It started running itself with people posting in it and interacting. So it's really nice to see that, I managed to create a sort of place, a virtual space where people can meet. While Women in Antiquity is obviously, I have to post the things in it, but they post a call for papers in the posts. So, and it was a way for me to also find the people all over the world, because I was invited to conferences thanks to it. I met scholars, so it was really an ideal platform, and the scholars don't consider it. They are a bit, I think now they consider social media a lot more, but when I created it 5 years ago, the situation was very different, and everybody was a bit surprised that I was putting so much effort into a Facebook page.
I've got a hand in my essay. Got a hand in my essay today for my PGCHE.
Exactly, that's how it started.
Yeah. Oh, really? Oh, because
Yes.
my essay I've got a hand in today is me writing up my project where I did the assessment in Rome and Britain, where people had to do Twitter feeds of going through a event in Romano British history, how they would perceive it from if they were a Roman soldier, or if they were Julius Caesar, or if they were a Gallic trader or whatever, and talking about how one can incorporate those things into academia. But it was interesting. I've read a few things on it, and there is still seemingly this resistance to social media in across academia, because it's not seen as being particularly academic, and a couple of the students, by and large the feedback I got from the students was very positive on it, but a few of them that were critical said that they didn't see how social media fits into the academic world, which kind of raises its own kind of question more broadly about how perceptions of social media perhaps need to change in higher education, and then they'll filter down to the students a bit more. But anyway, it was an interesting exercise, and just demonstrated the possibilities we have with social media in higher education and what we can do with it. I mean, as you found out, was it from surveying the students that joined us last year, that one of the main ways they discovered Kent or discovered classics and archaeology at Kent was via Facebook.
Facebook, yes.
It really shows the impact that you can have in a good way. Can be quite a negative way as well in other areas, but we won't go to that now.
Well,
Brexit.
Brexit, exactly. No, I mean, I think that for admissions we are really trying to use it as well. So Facebook, but it's not always possible to reach out. I mean, you can reach to the relatives of alumni, but probably they would do that themselves. They would talk about Kent to brothers and sisters, so. But we are trying. We're working. You're working on the page, the Facebook page of our department. So it's important to keep that profile. But I know that many lecturers and many students don't want to deal with social media. And so I think that it's important also not to force people to say, okay, you can only find this content here. Because some people feel like they are cut out by this word because they don't want to engage with it. And so, it's important to keep other platforms like the ordinary blogs and traditional, not ordinary, the traditional blogs, and
and podcasts.
And podcasts, exactly.
Is that what I'm doing it?
And I clapped my hands.
Just to quickly go background then to the book, or at least where the idea of the book came from. So that was based off of your PhD, correct? Yes. So how did you come to end up at Kent studying this topic? What was the path that led you here?
Well, I was at the University of Bologna, and participated to an excavation in Egypt, in Fayoum. Which is like a big oasis.
Portrait fame as well.
Famous for the portraits, yes, the funerary portraits. And it's an incredible place because basically it used to be a very fertile area, but then all of these ancient villages that were on the edges of this fertile area where all of a sudden they became desertified. I mean, they were completely abandoned because this oasis was changed in its size throughout history. So, this is because the channel that the irrigation channel that was connected to the Nile sometimes was well maintained throughout history, and sometimes it wasn't. And so, when it wasn't well maintained for bad historical reasons, adverse historical reasons, this oasis shrinked. And that's the reason why all the ancient villages, the ancient archaeological sites on the edge of this Fayum region are so well preserved, because they found themselves in the middle of the desert, but they used to be in very green areas before. So we went to this incredible site called Bakias, and I had the chance to excavate a village where there were temples, private houses, Roman baths. So I really saw the life of the everyday life of people under my eyes. I could see just the coins, the pieces of pottery with inscriptions everywhere I walked. So it was just, the archaeologist's heaven, really. And it was a difficult place where to be for a while, because, there were scorpions, horrible insects, but at the same time I was dream about going back there because it was just incredible. So when you deal with something like this, you can't go back. You just want to study something related to that site, something related to that place, find out who are the people that inhabited those houses. And I had the chance, I was lucky enough to study in Bologna amulets and statues coming from some of these private houses and also some of the temples. And I became more and more interested in domestic religion, domestic rituals. And then I found out that there are in Egypt, between the dynastic and the Greco-Roman period, there were rituals related to childbirth, specifically related to childbirth. And so I became interested in women's childbirth, birth rituals, and from that moment onwards, I decided that I wanted to know more and to investigate more. And so I sent a PhD proposal a bit to many universities, but here Kent had the magical formula of a papyrologist, Chabalada, who was also interested in women because he studies ethnic names of women in Greco-Roman Egypt, and Patty Baker, who studies Greco-Roman medicine, and she could really help me gaining a better knowledge of the medical aspects of childbirth, menstruation. And so it was just a magical combination, so I really decided to come here, and it was really the right choice. So yeah.
And now you're here on it as a permanent lecturer.
Yes. I just stayed here. Yes. So it was. I would. There was a bit of luck there, and obviously I also worked a lot for it. So I mean, I think that I also found a very good environment, both with the colleagues at Kent, but also all the conferences that took place throughout this year. So I went to like 13 conferences during my PhD. I met lots of people. So, and I think that really made the PhD, the fact that, giving papers at these conferences, getting feedback from hundreds of people. And that is really fundamental for every PhD student to do. You can't just stay in your room to writing your work. You need to interact and check what's being written.
Yeah.
So
goes back to what you were saying earlier about the Facebook group as well, though.
Exactly.
There are many ways now of finding out what's going on in the world. But you say it's so important to get out there and meet people and interact and see what other people are doing and get their thoughts on what you're doing. I suppose sometimes, particularly when you're a PhD student, you can way before that. I mean, sometimes you can be a little bit like, oh, I don't know if I want to put this out there yet because I don't want it to be criticise, but you have to go through that. You have to develop a thick skin,
yes.
and that's the best way of improving what you're doing, really.
Sometimes I think that I was brave, more brave when I was a PhD student than now, because I went with crazily prepared papers to Oxford and Cambridge, giving papers there, and I was like, and when I think about it now, I think, no, what did I do? But then they went well, and I got very useful feedback. So maybe they were not the perfect papers, but it was fundamental to go there and to meet the big experts, world experts. So it was great to have the guts to do that. And I was a PhD student as well. They knew that. So, they encouraged me rather than destroying me.
That's the thing, isn't it? When you go to do a paper at a conference, you need to bear in mind, and the audience should always bear in mind as well, that what you're talking about is rarely a finished article.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
It's something that you're in the process of putting together, and that's why you're presenting it, because you want people's feedback, you want people's observations, and you're putting it out there with the intention of largely trying to improve it. So, yeah, no, it's the best way of, one of the best ways of improving, I think.
But you're right. I mean, many PhD students are very scared to do that. So
also as well, it's just going out and talking in front of audiences.
Yes,
that's a big part of it as well.
Yes.
Learning how to do that is a fundamental aspect of progressing in academia, and I think just more widely, it's a good skill to develop as well. It kind of builds just a sense of, natural confidence to some degree.
Well, we, as a former PhD student in the UK, we're lucky because we got teaching experience from in almost the beginning. So that helps when you have to give papers because you're used to it. So
although sometimes I get a bit scared because when I taught Carl in his first year.
Oh, yes.
I get a bit worried now I'm going to spawn another Carl somewhere. I'm kidding.
No.
Just quickly then, because you're turning your attention now to figurines, right? That's the...
Well, yes. Well, I guess we could define them as figurines because it's a safer way to define them. I'm writing an article on dolls now at the moment, which are figurines in the end. And I am trying to investigate the function and the meaning of gendered dolls. So... First, what are gendered dolls? So whether they are just dolls that represent women, or they are dolls that, in my opinion, they are more than just that. They are dolls that are exclusively associated with women. So I'm trying to find a way to show how these dolls can be a proper gender indicator, for example, in archaeological contexts. So, to do that is very difficult because... sometimes you don't have a very clear archaeological context. So I'm really looking at a lot of data coming from the Roman period, from the Greek world, and from Egypt, and I'm comparing them. And I'm also, by doing this, I'm also investigating the meaning of the term doll and whether it is perceived in the same way. So I will show this in the article. So. Hopefully.
It's interesting though, as you were saying, because the book in some respects, as I suppose most people's PhDs end up being, it's really a step into a wider world. You say you're now writing this article, but I imagine there's a tremendous amount more to say, as you were saying earlier, on the various themes that you approached in the book as well. That is kind of the tip of the iceberg for understanding.
It is, yes.
Particularly the everyday life of women in the ancient world, like broadly as well. There's so much to be explored there.
It is, yes. There is so much, yes, and so, but we really need to also pay attention to being rigorous in the way we approach sources. So being interdisciplinary doesn't mean to generalize on things, but it means really struggling and working hard to become a rigorous archaeologist, or at least understanding archaeological reports and not relying on what someone else has written, and at the same time work on literary sources and make sure that you can find some way to compare them to archaeological sources. So that's the real difficulty in what I do, at least. So But I know, obviously, that being a pure archaeologist is very, very difficult in other ways, because you have that context and you have to really, show what it means, and you have other people that might not agree with you. So, yeah, each each field has its difficulties, really.
Yeah. But as I say, it's going well though. It's going well.
I'm happy. I'm having fun. Yes,
that's the most important thing. As long as you're still enjoying it, then you're doing the right thing.
Yeah.
So I mean, just to finish then. So the book is now out. The book is available online.
Yes, it is available online and also as a hard copy. I mean, it's also basically divided into chapters. So if a person is mainly interested in, I don't know, coming of age, then you can get chapter 1. So that's how ebooks nowadays work. Yeah. And hard copies should be in all the possible libraries. I'm trying to make sure that people know about it, because these hard copies are very expensive.
Oh yeah.
Yes. So I'm when people say I really want to read it, I don't say buy it. I say, check that maybe you could find it in the library. I cannot give copies, but I can recommend a way to access it without getting broke. Yeah.
And alongside that, if anybody hasn't, go away and check the Women in Antiquity Facebook page as well.
Yes.
Join up to the community there.
Yes, that would be great, actually. Yes. I mean, I will, I promise I will put more updates, because I've been very lazy lately. Yes, I mean, Women in Antiquity Network as well. I will try to put more call for papers. Also, if people are interested to really put call for papers, just things they're interested in. So it could be very beneficial for everyone interested in women. So, cool. Their publications as well. Yeah.
Right, fantastic stuff. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks to you.